For the last few years, I've been trying to revisit a lot of the anime I watched as a kid, focusing particularly on the shows that had a huge impact on me, like Outlaw Star and Dot Hack Sign. But there was one series I fell in love with as a kid that evolved into a bit of an obsession for the better part of 4 to 5 years. That thing was Gundam. But instead of rewatching one of the shows I grew up with, I decided to try watching one of the new series, so without doing any research whatsoever, I hopped into Gundam Unicorn and watched the whole thing. This is probably where all the Gundam fans watching started getting red flags, cause yeah, I had no idea what was going on. Turns out Unicorn takes place in the Universal Century timeline, which has a bunch of different series, movies, OVAs, and even an amusement park ride in the list of content pertaining to it. Not only that, Unicorn takes place near the end of the timeline, so probably not a great place to start. Don't get me wrong, I didn't dislike the show, although I don't think I'll ever get used to CGI mechs, but if my goal was to revisit the things I loved as a child, why was I trying to jump into something new? If I was going to do this right, I should have gone back to where it all began, to the show that introduced me to Gundam in the first place. It's time to revisit Gundam properly. Before I get into my revisitation of Gundam Wing, I wanted to take a moment to talk about Gunpla. For those of you that don't know, Gunpla are the model kits created by Bandai, and they are huge. Not huge in size, mind you, but popular, although some can get big. You see, Gundam for me wasn't just about the TV shows. Model building and Gunpla specifically were a big part of my childhood years. Since quarantine struck, I found myself revisiting things like miniature painting and model making, which I hadn't done in over a decade, and I'm glad I returned. It's been a nice, non-screen hobby to participate in and create cool things. So in preparation for revisiting Gundam Wing, I decided I need to do this right. After all, if my goal was to revisit something as an adult that I loved as a child, I need to do the whole thing. I need to rewatch Wing and build the first Gunpla I ever bought as a kid, which was this one. Funny thing about Gunpla, as a kid I remember always being super enamored with the pictures of the models on the side of the box, expecting that's what my finished product would look like, and it never did. I was always bummed and disappointed that the thing I built didn't look anything like the ones on the box. But now I'm an adult with disposable income, and I know about things like clippers and putty. There's YouTube tutorials and thin cement. I have sanding tools and I have an airbrush, so I should be able to pull this off, right? So I haven't watched Gundam Wing since I was a kid, maybe around 12 or 13, which means that the amount of things I remember about the plot and characters is honestly very little. I remembered a couple things, like Zex losing his mask at some point. I remembered the weird, evil version of Wing Gundam called Unit Zero, and funnily enough, the scene where Hiro rips up Relina's invitation to her birthday party. I think the only reason I remember that scene is because my friends and I thought it was funny back then. Obviously, it's a super mean thing to do, but I just think it was funny because the scene goes from 0 to 60 so fast, and that sheer emotional whiplash just makes it hilarious. Anyway, watching the show was really interesting. On one hand, I feel a lot less attached to it. Maybe it's just age. After all, over half of my lifetime has passed since I watched this. I'm pretty much a completely different person now, so I sort of feel like I'm seeing the series with fresh eyes, almost unclouded by nostalgia. Because, like I said, I hardly remember anything from this show. That being said, it's impossible to avoid some nostalgia. There are moments in the show where I go, oh yeah, I remember this shot. Like it's just been sitting in the back of my brain for almost 2 decades, just waiting to reemerge. It's interesting though, because when I watched this show as a kid, I remember loving the characters and all of the different mobile suits that appeared throughout the series. I think at one point I may have even owned all 5 of the main Gundams from the show. But watching this as an adult, I can't say I connect with any of the characters in any way. There's a very distinct melodramatic flair to everything that I find myself not really connecting with. However, one thing I've honestly found the most fun from this experience is seeing all of these mobile suits that I had completely forgot about. For instance, the first time Gundam Epion appears on screen, I audibly went, "Oh yeah!" I had completely forgotten about this guy. Not only that, I forgot I owned his Gunpla and everything. Memory is weird, man. Speaking of Gunpla, my primary goal in building this Gunpla model was to make it look as close to the box art as I could. That meant using a lot of techniques and tools that I had learned recently through mini painting, but not necessarily anything I was super good at, to be frank. Nevertheless, I'm trekking on, trying to really take my time, sanding the various pieces one by one, and trying as best as I can to keep the various pieces organized. My plan is to get all of the colored pieces painted exactly the same at the same time, but that means not assembling much until I can get most of the primary parts prepared and then painted. I wanted to avoid having pieces that are supposed to be the same color look different because the paint was thinned too much or not at all. I wanted everything to be very, very uniform. This is all in contrast to what I used to do as a kid, which was treat these things like big Lego sets, where I'd literally rip the pieces off the sprues by hand, no clippers or anything, and then just snap everything together. Within maybe 3 hours, I had a finished Gundam model, but again, it didn't look like the box, and it was messy, and then I just got disappointed, and yet I kept buying these things. So this model is going to take a long time for me to finish, but if all goes according to plan, it'll look really cool by the end. Now, back to Gundam Wing. So something I didn't realize about Gundam Wing is that it's very long, 49 episodes long, which for an anime is kind of a lot. At least for me. Please don't at me, One Piece fans. I know, I am fully aware of how long your show is. After getting about 22 episodes in, I decided I needed a slight break, and then I remembered that Gundam Wing wasn't the only show I watched as a kid. Toonami aired quite a few of them, from War in the Pocket, Stardust Memory, and even the original series at one point, all of which I watched. But there was another series that I adored. A really short one. I wonder if that's on Hulu. Oh my god, it is. As far as I can remember, 08th MS Team, I think I'm saying that right, was the first other Gundam show I watched and fell in love with. It first aired in the United States in 2001 and ran for 12 episodes, the last of which never actually aired in the US apparently. Before I started watching this, I thought that the show always ended on the cliffhanger in episode 11, so imagine my surprise when I found out there's an entire other episode that we just never saw. Episode 12 acts as a kind of epilogue to the show. It is interesting at times, but downright cheesy at others. Truthfully, I think the series would have been better off without it, as once it's over, I kinda wish the show had just ended at episode 11 instead. Nonetheless, I was surprised at how much more I enjoyed 8th Team decades removed from it. The main protagonist, Shiro Amada, becomes the commander of a small faction of Gundam pilots during the One-Year War, the same conflict from the original Mobile Suit Gundam series. Rather than the story focusing on larger geopolitical issues, we instead focus on a core group of characters led by Shiro. Everyone gets at least an episode where they're the star player, and their stakes are a lot more personal and relatable than that of the larger impersonal conflict happening between Earth and the colonies. Alongside the smaller conflict happening on Earth, there's a love story interwoven throughout the show between Shiro and a Zion mobile suit pilot named Aina. Fun fact about me, I have a thing for stories featuring star-crossed lovers, which might actually be this show's fault. After all, I first saw it when I was 11, and it must have left quite an impression on me. And while, yes, Shiro and Aina kind of fall in love really fast, it still acts as a way for the show to talk about its core themes, which are empathy and understanding. As the show progressed, I feel like I could understand how these two people would have ended up together and formed a bond, even if it kinda happens overnight. However, they have an undeniable chemistry that I still found endearing 19 years later. Overall, I'd say, as an adult, I find myself enjoying the tone and the characters in 8th Team much more than that of Wing, at least where I am so far. Which feels weird to say, after all, Wing was my first Gundam show, and as a kid, I was incredibly passionate about it. But now it just feels different. Obviously, when I first watched it, I was 10 years old, and I'm 30 now. I am basically a completely different person, so the same themes are not going to resonate with me as they did when I was young. But before we wrap up Gundam Wing and the film Endless Waltz, let's keep working on this Gunpla. My plan was to build each of these pieces separately, and then deconstruct, prime, and paint them one by one. The first part would have been the head, but tragedy struck. While attempting to airbrush the first pieces of the head, I dropped the airbrush on my foot, bending the needle, breaking some of the internal parts, and drawing blood. So that was fun. Rest in peace, little airbrush nozzle. You served me well. So, while I waited for my new nozzle to come in the mail, I continued building the rest of the parts. Here's a random thought I had while building this leg. I can't tell if Gunpla models look better than they used to, or if I've gotten better at this, or the fact that this is a master grade model and the ones my mom was buying me as a child were the cheapest ones. But even unpainted, these things look pretty cool. But I'm kinda shocked how far these things have come in the last few decades. Again, I don't know if that's just my head. Nevertheless, despite the tragedy of the airbrush, I'm trucking along. I have this feeling like I'm gonna like how this final product comes out. Good thing I have 27 more episodes of Gundam Wing to watch while I build this thing. Jesus Christ. Okay, let's do this. Alright, so back to Gundam Wing. I said earlier that the show just felt different to me as an adult, and don't get me wrong, I don't think it's a bad show by any means. There's some interesting stuff going on here, even if it feels like the show kind of stumbles over its messages at times. If I had to sum it all up in one word, I'd say it's conflicted. On one hand, it wants to be a show about a bunch of young guys piloting giant robots, but then on the other hand, it's this saga of geopolitical wars laced with commentary on total pacifism versus warmongering and the dehumanization of war. The most obvious analog for this being the mobile dolls, walking war machines with no pilots. To me, it felt like the show wanted to dig into so many different topics across its 49 episodes, but it never quite seems to dig too deep on any of them. The moral of the story ends up being something akin to total pacifism doesn't work, but neither does the dehumanization of warfare, as it paradoxically leads to more death in the long run, as people aren't forced to confront the destruction they cause. I think my overall problem with Wing as an adult is that it feels like it doesn't know what it wants to be. Does it want to be a fun show for kids and teenagers / vehicle for selling model kits and toys? Or does it want to dig into its themes extensively and discuss topics like the military-industrial complex, the dangers of fascism, the idealism of true pacifism versus systematic warfare, both literally and figuratively? The answer is a little bit of all of it, and the problem is that it makes the show feel a bit unfocused. Something that stood out to me was a scene that occurs about halfway through the show, when Catra uses Wing Zero to destroy an entire colony. This is a place, if I had to guess, with hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people living there. Let's not beat around the bush here. Catra commits a war crime. He kills everyone that lives there in the blink of an eye, and he feels a little guilty about it, like just a little bit. But then the show kind of just marches on like it never happened. Catra gets to remain one of the heroes, and they play off his actions like it was a mistake in the heat of passion. I counted maybe 2 or 3 times it was ever brought up again during the entire show, and my recollection is they never talk about the thousands or likely millions of lives that were snuffed out of existence for no reason. It's always just framed as this mistake that he made and not one of the largest mass casualty events that's probably ever occurred in human history. Then we just move on. Never mind all the people who died were civilians caught in a war they didn't really have anything to do with. We don't have time for that, even though this show is 49 episodes long. It's time to get back to the giant robots, I guess. I'm sure this all sounds like I ended up hating the show upon revisitation, but I didn't. In fact, during the first few episodes, I was surprised that the show felt a lot deeper and thematic through my adult eyes. As a kid, I only ever saw the robots, and these kids who were only slightly older than me wielding these giant walking tanks that were, and still are, awesome. However, by the time I reached the 49th episode, I was honestly a bit drained. I felt like I had failed to recapture the feelings I had when I was a child watching this show. It just didn't feel as though it held up to my memory of it. On some level, I don't think that's Wing's fault. I'm almost 2 decades older than I was when I first saw it. I'm seeing this all from a completely different perspective. Then I rewatched Endless Waltz, the sort of epilogue film to this series. Watching this movie felt like seeing an HD remaster of a game that you loved as a kid. You see it and you think, yeah, this looks exactly how I remember it. Sweet. But then you see how it actually looked and you think, oh god, did it always look that bad? Endless Waltz takes place a year after the series ends, and follows our heroes as they adapt to this new peaceful world. Of course, it wouldn't be Gundam without a fascist movement stoking the flames of war once again. Endless Waltz feels about the same to me as the series did. All of the same criticisms I have about the show seem to spill right over into this, even though there are genuinely some good scenes that I think probably should have made it into the show proper. For example, Hiro blowing up the military base and accidentally hitting the apartments next to it. That's good stuff right there. That gives us more insight into the character, but it doesn't really go anywhere. All in all, I feel the same way about Endless Waltz as I did about the show, but we'll talk about all that in a second. Right now, it's time to see this final Gunpla all finished up. Okay, so this turned out okay. Far from being perfect. I made a lot of mistakes. I dropped an airbrush, I briefly lost and then found some pieces, and the gray paint I used in the airbrush to apply shading ended up making the Gundam look more battle damaged than I intended. It was a bit naive of me to think that I could just come out swinging and make this thing look box perfect on my first go. After all, I haven't done anything like this in a long time. But all in all, I'm not unhappy with it. I think with enough time I could have fixed a lot of the problems here, but this video has to get finished at some point, right? If this experience has shown me anything, it's that we can't always hold on to the things we love. While I enjoyed many aspects of my Gundam revisit, there were some parts that felt like a slog. As I enter my 30s and start to look back on the things I loved as a kid, I start to wonder if nostalgia can be an enemy sometimes. We all grow up with stuff we love and we think it'll always be there for us. And in a way it is. We have easy access to media these days in a way that I never did as a kid. Watching Gundam as an 11-year-old required me to get home from school and sit by the TV every day at a specific time. These days I can just turn on Hulu and shotgun like 5 episodes in a row. It somehow makes it feel less special, but it also points out a lot of the show's flaws as well. Flaws that were not so apparent when you only got 1 episode a day. I can see why I was so attached to it as a kid, because back then anime was not as prevalent in the States as it is now. Compared to all of the other cartoons airing at the time, things like Gundam Wing and Dragon Ball Z felt like things from another planet. But at the same time, I'm not an 11-year-old anymore. I'm not the same person that loved this as a kid, but I didn't hate going back either. All in all, I might watch some other Gundam series in the future. Will I ever go back to Wing? Probably not, but that's okay. It's okay to leave some things in the past when you enjoyed them the most. Like the images on the box, they don't always look the way you remember or expect, but sometimes it is fun to dig up the past for another ride and be reminded of earlier times. You might be surprised what you find.